Hello and welcome back. This is part 2 of our PowerPoint on chapter 16, talking about works from ancient Greece. And we're actually moving to a different era now. So we are looking at this work here, and maybe we can look at this piece and say it looks very familiar. And so we are looking at this work here. If we count the people in the scene, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is actually an early painting of Jesus and his disciples. And so something that we are noticing is that this painting looks like it was put into a cave. So why would there be a painting of Christ in a cave or an underground dwelling of some sort? You can probably guess that at the time this was made, Christianity wasn't the big influential religion that it is today. In fact, in ancient Rome at the time, it was almost taboo to be following this religion. And so this is Christ and the apostles, believed to have been made around the mid-4th century, so almost 300 years after Christ's death. Followers of Christianity initially forced to hide, and these paintings were found in these burial chambers called catacombs. So you can say that in ancient Rome at the time, Christianity was somewhat a growing religion. It wasn't something that everyone shifted into during his time. Instead, it was something that people gradually started to catch on to. And now let's take a look at this sculpture here. He's actually one of the most important leaders in ancient Rome. This is a statue of Constantinople. And what Constantine did was he was the first emperor to acknowledge and also to adopt Christianity as their main religion. Something about Christianity, it is a religion where spiritual values are stronger than failing stability of material world. And so what Constantine did during his lifetime was he moved the capital of Rome he moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, or you can call this the Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire. When this occurred, you can say that it wasn't a very clean shift into a state where Christianity was accepted. So before this, you can say that ancient Romans had their more polytheistic religion. They didn't exactly have one religion that they all followed, but Constantine made it so that the people under his reign were to follow this religion. And so you can imagine how difficult that might be. It actually resulted to the splitting of that empire. So the Roman Empire was divided to an eastern and a western half. And this happened in 476. So the Byzantine Empire was established, and during this time there was extensive building programs. So because of the growing religion, they had to find a way to establish buildings where they can follow their worship, where they can continue their church rituals. So here's an example of what some of the Byzantine architecture looked like. This is St. Peter's Basilica. This is a basilica made for public worship. The apse is at the end. So the apse is actually the area where the altar is. If you can imagine, if you've been in a Christian church before, you'll notice, of course, the aisle that people walk through, or the aisle that priests walk through, and towards the end of the hall is the altar, and they have the apse. So what is the apse? It's basically that semicircular space behind the altar. So in a Christian church, you'll see the altar there, you'll see the apse. Something about the apse and the altar, that is usually where the highest point of the ceiling in most churches are, or most Christian churches are. So if you go to a Christian church, the next time you go to one, check out the aisle, check out the altar, look at the semicircular space behind the altar, and look to see if that's where the highest point of the building is. Something about the altars in general is they usually have a artifact of a saint there, so that way they have something that is connected to the church. So there's also these types of designs, these mosaic designs utilizing a tesserae. So this is what it looks like from the old St. Peter's Basilica. Not too different from the way it looks now. This is just a painting that was made centuries ago. And so this is what the floor plan of the basilica looks like. So we have the gate, the atrium is normally a type of gathering space. We have the nave, the aisle, and then the transept where the altar usually is, and then the apse, that semicircular area. And so if you look at the architecture itself, even this shape here is quite subtle, but it still resembles that of a cross or of a crucifix. So you'll see a lot of this symbology in their architecture. So when it comes to this Byzantine art, a lot of it is very flat, but very decorative. And an example of this Byzantine art can be found here in the San Vitale. So all of these links that I'm scrolling through, these are all on our modules, so check them out if you want to see the way they look from the inside. And so more about Byzantine art. This is Empress Theodora. So you could say Constantine is one of the most influential leaders. Also, the Emperor Justinian and his Empress Theodora. This was made from a mosaic. In other words, different materials put together, usually different materials of the same color, and that allows for the surface to have different levels of color, in that the light bouncing upon these mosaics allow for us to look at the color, and it feels very different. Feels very different from looking at a flat surface of one particular color. And so these mosaics give a little bit of a an unearthly feeling. It feels somewhat translucent. And so if you think about artwork in general inside churches, they are there to help contemplate prayer, to help us meditate, and so on. And so this is actually in the apse area of the San Vitale. Something that is quite interesting here, if you see the way Jesus is portrayed in the center, he feels a little bit different from what we might have seen in the past. And so during this time, there was a lot of controversy, especially within the church, that there was a day where they decided, it's supposed to be against a religion for people to make works that look like them. So we are probably wondering, why would that be? Or how is that possible? Or why would it be bad? Well, for one thing is, if you think about in Christianity, Jesus, if he was to be portrayed a certain way, it might make people look at him differently. Maybe he's being portrayed wrongly, so it was taboo for there to be any artwork to be based off of him or anything from the Bible. And so this is an image of Christ without a beard. So you're probably wondering, you probably haven't seen too many images of that. This is called the Pantocrator, or the ruler of the universe. So in the San Vitale apse, this is what it looks like from the inside. So right away, very highly decorative panels, and that's what usually the apses are for. It gives the architects a chance to add more design, to add more murals and paintings. We see the use of hierarchic scale. Okay, so a little bit more about what I was just talking about earlier when it came to the images that were based off of Christ and the Bible. That is called this type of iconoclastic controversy, or image breakers, or iconoclasts. So there was a punishment for those who owned images of Christ, Mary, saints, and angels. So during this time, there was a lot of artwork that was actually destroyed. And a lot of them were made from precious materials. So a lot of very valuable things were lost during this time. And so you can imagine the Christian church at the time was somewhat steady, but there were many variations that somewhat broke away from the main church, but still very similar. And that's what led to these Orthodox styles, or these other Orthodox churches. And there was a style of art that came from one of them, the Eastern Orthodox style. Something that is mentioned is closely supervised. In other words, they were able to make their own art based off of Christianity, but at the same time, it had to be approved by others, by the main church. So when it came to the portrayal of Christ and the saints and the apostles, they were portrayed differently, and I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit. Instead of portraying them as human-like, or their normal selves, they were portrayed a little bit more mystically. And so this is an example of the Eastern Orthodox style. So we have the church figures painted with angelic wings. You'll see the halo painted around them. Okay, so this was a big change from the earlier portrayals of Christ and the saints, in that they were portrayed more or less how they appeared when they were alive. And so this church painted them again with a little bit more religious expressive freedom. So they painted wings on them, they painted halos on them. This is by Andrei Rublev. The painting is called Old Testament Trinity, made in 1410. And so the figures are very slender. They feel mystified, almost as though they are floating or they are flying. Okay, so this too was influenced by this Eastern Orthodox style. So we have a very large portrayal of the Virgin or Mary in the center, and we have Christ here as a baby or as a toddler, and we have the angels beside her. A very strong sense or strong use of the hierarchic scale. If you look at the way the architecture was rendered, or this throne that she is sitting on, it is very three-dimensional. You could say the space depiction isn't exactly all there just yet. This is an early attempt to capture form. And something about this image is there's a lot of the gold panel, and you can't really see that from a photograph. So if you can imagine, the gold areas have a little bit more luster than what we are looking at now. So this is called Madonna and Child on a Curved Throne. And so I had a student ask me in the past, why do they call Mary Madonna? And so I wonder if any of you guys know. So who can tell me why is Mary called Madonna sometimes? Well, I'll just tell you now. Madonna means my lady in Italian. So there you go. So Madonna is my lady. And so a lot of interesting circular shapes and linear patterns. So a lot of this Christian art during the time started to become a little more decorative. And a lot of that was contributed through things like the Eastern Orthodox style. And so now we're going to shift into the Middle Ages in Europe. So if you want to think about it in terms of time, around the 1100s or so. So what is medieval art? It is this influence that was created by the interaction with these European countries and their nomadic invaders. So you can say in Italy at the time, there were a lot of nomadic groups that were not exactly from the same region. They're mostly likely from the north, and that they all came into their country on horseback. They didn't have a written language, but they had their own distinct artistic style, a very decorative style. And when people of these Christian countries were intermingling with these more nomadic cultures, they came up with a new style that was a little bit of a hybrid of both. And so this is one depiction of that. So right away, we see the horse. That is the influence of these nomadic cultures, but also we see the figure that is kneeling in prayer. So it's a little bit of Christianity and also this somewhat outside influence. one of the most important contributions from the medieval style were things like this depiction here. The exceptional technical metalwork skill. That was something that was brought over from these nomadic tribes. Gold and enamel with motifs. This is actually a purse cover. So a lot of intricate symmetrical designs, very precise, and a lot of skill involved. Some of these nomadic tribes were actually Islamic groups, and that they were the ones that brought over these types of metallic skills. This is one of the most popular examples of artwork that came out of the medieval period. And so if you are familiar with Christianity, you might see some of these Greek letters here. You might see the X and the P and the O. Very highly decorated, very dense patterns. And so the X and the P in Greek letters is chi rho, another way to say Jesus Christ. And so this is Book of Kells, the illuminated manuscript. On my PowerPoint it says illustrated manuscript. It is illuminated manuscript from Ireland. So this chi rho monogram is from the Book of Kells, made during the late 8th century. Okay, so we talked about the medieval period. Now we're going to talk about the Romanesque period. And this was a distinguished European Christian architecture of the 11th and 12th centuries. So during the Romanesque period, there was a lot of focus on architecture. This happened during times of feudalism and monasticism. In other words, this was a time when the church had a lot of conflict. There were a lot of groups breaking away from the church, but at the same time, they were building things like monasteries. Monasteries were the buildings where, or the schools, or the dwellings of many of those who aspired to become a priest. And so during the Romanesque period, there was a lot of these religious pilgrimages. Many, if you're probably wondering what is a pilgrimage, maybe some of you know, what is a pilgrimage? Pilgrimage is basically a type of a voyage that one undergoes to reach a certain level of spirituality. And so say that you are going to church, and that you want to break away from everything. You want to think about your faith. You'll do something like go to a very holy place. Maybe if you're a Christian, you'll go to let's say you can go to St. Peter's Basilica, or you can go to the Vatican City. So these are pilgrimages that people would go through. And during the Romanesque period, you could say there was a very strong growth in the number of people that were joining the church. So they had to build larger churches. So during the Byzantine era, there was buildings being built, but during the Romanesque period, you could say that they expanded on this. So it grew even more, it grew exponentially. And so something about this chapter in general is there's a lot of different eras in that started from the ancient Greece. So we talked about the archaic, the classical, the Hellenistic, and now we're talking a little bit about the Byzantine and the Romanesque. So I'm hoping that you guys can remember all of that. And if you have trouble or if you have questions, just let me know. But anyways, let's keep going. During the Romanesque period, there was a lot of large buildings being made. They needed to feel more stable. The churches were almost like massive fortresses. There were a lot of stone carvings during the Romanesque period. So again, when it comes to the exam, look for these characteristics that make each of these periods unique. And so here is one of the large carvings. This is called the Christ of the Pentecost. And right away, we can see the use of hierarchic scale. You'll notice that this very large relief sculpture is very wide. You'll notice the different registers. There is an upper register. What I mean is the outer edge of the circle, the semicircular shape. There's also the center area where you can see Christ and you can see many of the people around him. And then on the bottom register, there are smaller people in that they are engaged in different activities. In a way, each register represents different people and it is symbolic of their importance. Okay. So the people in the very bottom, it looks like they are probably in a purgatory of some sort. And so now we're going to talk about the Gothic period. The Gothic period can be recognized by their very sharp arches. And so something about the Gothic style that we can easily remember is that their churches have very tall, pointed rooftops. Okay, so if you see a cathedral and that the rooftops are very pointy, it's probably Gothic style. Also, coming from that style was these stained glass windows. So stained glass windows played a major part in many churches during the time, but also in today's standards. And why do they make these arches or these rooftops the way they did? Basically, they wanted to try to make them as high as possible to allow for people in the building to feel a little bit closer to heaven, so that they have this space in between themselves and the ceiling, so that very tall space allows for people to feel a little bit more a little bit more in a meditative or a contemplative state of mind, symbolize joyous spiritual elation. And so this is one of the prime examples of the Gothic style, the Notre Dame de Chartres. It is built and changed for more than 300 years, the center of community life. And you can see the rose window from this perspective, the very large window there. So check out that video, the video link. There's also a closer look link. If you guys like to look at that, it actually gives a lot of really good information. And this is what it looks like from the west facade. So again, Gothic style, very pointed arches, very high ceilings. And then also the stained glass windows. And this is the rose window that I was talking about earlier, one of the most iconic examples of stained glass window. Very intricate pattern, and So when we look at something like the stained glass window, it's almost a result of all of the early Christian styles. So, uh, of course, we have the portrayals of Christ and the apostles and the saints, and then we have some images of the Bible in more mystical, stylistic renders, and also the nomadic style, the medieval style with the very intricate patterns and designs. We can see all of that on these stained glass windows. The Rose de France window, made it in 1233. So if we were to go to the Notre Dame de Chartres from up close, we can actually see more of the details on the architecture, like this example here. And you notice the figures are portrayed very mystically, very, very, very much inspired by the Eastern Orthodox style. And if you look at the capitals themselves, what I mean by that is the design right above the pillar that connects the roof and the pillar, a very intricate, very complex design. And you could even see figures on these capitals. And that they look like figures with their hands in prayer. So the style has changed a lot throughout these years. Okay, so again, another link of the Chartres Cathedral, this panoramic view, so check that out. And so there are other examples of worship and ritual that we can briefly talk about. And for this chapter, we talked primarily about the early Christian style, the early and more like mid-century Christian style. But we should also talk a little bit about some of these other religions and their variations, or how they portray their artwork. And one example here is this, approaching the sacred Sheikh Lufta Mosque in Iran. And so the architecture looks very much like, or the designs feel very much like the medieval period, because that is when the Christian countries were interacting a little bit more with the outside countries. And so, again, when it comes to Islamic style, this style involves a lot of very intricate geometric patterns. And if you look at the arch, it almost feels like a Gothic arch, except it's not as sharp, it's not as high towards the ceiling, but still very reminiscent. Okay. And so this was built in the 17th century. There's this underlying order and rhythm that lead to the awareness of God, or Allah. So Allah is the main God of Islamic culture. The reason why you see a lot of color and pattern is that if you are Muslim, they look at pattern as a way to get closer to God. So imagine, the cycle of life, of nature, that this omnipresent idea of repetition, for us to, or for people to be aware of this idea, allows for them to become closer to Allah. Okay, and so that's it for this chapter. Let me know what you guys think. I know it's a lot of information, but look through the chapter objectives, look through the key terms list, and let me know if you need any help.